And we're live.
And we have no plan for this discussion.
Absolutely none. It's going to go great. It's
It
going to be the
is,
best podcast ever. It
no
already
doubt.
is. I just
Of
said it.
course.
I think so. I think this is like prophecy, but it's self-fulfilling and it's happening at the moment that you're saying it because that's the best podcast imaginable is you saying that it is and that making it because you predicted it. I mean, that's an epic prediction to make. But
It's embodying the epic
the logos.
podcast. No logos. We're not allowed.
No
Logos is not allowed
logos.
here. No
Oh,
logos.
what about Legos? The Lego movie. The logos of the Lego movie.
I bet you there's a logos to the Lego movie.
Oh, have you seen
Why
the
don't
Lego
you
movie?
tell us about the logos of the Lego movie, Paul?
Oh, it's how everything is awesome, right? And then it's
And then it's
that
not.
the universe, you can construct it and change chunks of it because it's like little pieces that stick together. Like that's just the whole everything. It's like the end of Dark City. You seen Dark
What's
City?
Dark City?
Dark City came out like right around the same time as The Matrix, and it weirdly similar thematically. It's a little like what was that? WALL-E, the movie War had sort of the same ending as WALL-E, but it's this movie sort of has the kind of rugged
So I have it. Okay, so let's do
protagonist.
something real fast. I have a question. I'm actually like curious to ask the two of you at the same time. So you know Radica, right? Like well you don't, but someone Paul said that AGI is a false god. And I was just wondering why would anybody think that? And I think the two of you are probably good people to ask that. So, Xander, why don't you go first?
AGI is a unicorn. I mean, we have people running around saying that we're going to generate this super intelligence that's kind of human like, whose motives we can understand and communicate with because we want a little brother. And we expect that it's going to be something we can recognize. It's not going to be profoundly autistic or pathological, and that it's going to reason in ways that we can understand. And I just find all those assumptions unfounded and arrogant at the present moment. Down the line, as we learn more, they may become less arrogant. But right now, it seems like techno optimism without actually grappling with the paths development might take along the way. So AI is going to keep developing. We already have AI. It tends to be autistic savant AI in terms of trying to recommend you the next product to buy or how to optimize a route. But in terms of making a friend for humanity, we have this created ideal of AGI as a super intelligence who is us without all of our flaws.
That's so odd, though, because I mean, I guess it depends on your circles, but especially after going through super intelligence, that's kind of the last sense of what I would think of AGI as.
Okay, so I haven't read
Intelligence
super
is like a
intelligence.
stage. Is that what you mean, or what are you
Excuse me?
describing there? Going
I'm sorry.
super is
So, Super Intelligence is a book by Nick Bostrom.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Mhm.
I knew there was something that was making the grammar not semantically sense. Okay. So,
Yeah.
all right. So he
Well,
talks about
he basically,
AGI
I
and
mean, the title of the book's like Paths, I think Dangers, but he basically talks about, the different paths that we could take through to AGI, the possibility of intelligence explosion and the benefits of getting there first, and also just the dangers associated with it, right? Where it's not like, everybody talks about Asimov's three rules, right? Well, obviously that was just like a starting point. The thing with these types of systems is you can't necessarily set really specific parameters, right?
they break
Like
down
any
pretty
intelligence system.
quickly.
I'm sorry, say that again.
They break down pretty quickly. It's the same
Right,
reason it's like impossible to fully enumerate the rules of parenting or something.
right.
They're and actually for the same reason. But yeah, the
So
same collection of reasons for the same core. Yeah.
right. And
Okay,
obviously, people who work in artificial intelligence find dealing with these questions really ridiculous because it's so far from their everyday reality. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So the question is like, like at least from Bostrom's perspective, my question is the concern about the intelligence explosion in the way that Bostrom explains it, which I know both of you haven't read, but you can assume that it's sort of the more nuanced understanding of the possibilities of artificial intelligence, not techno-optimism, where there actually could be like something that reaches a certain level of intelligence and also is capable of optimizing its intelligence in a way that nothing else is going to be able to catch up with. Although that assumes that it would want to continually optimize its intelligence, which is another thing that could be arrogant, right?
Xander, you wanna respond to that first, or I got something? But...
Sure, I can respond to that. So I'm going to bring in another reference besides Superintelligence by Bostrom, and that is the book Super Gods by Warren Ellis. It is a very obscure comic. The basic idea is that the Cold War was not one of nuclear weapons, but one of nations engineering divine beings, and leading to an arms race in engineering divine beings. And of course, that doesn't end very well for humanity. So in the case of looking at AGI, it's hard not to see this becoming a geopolitical issue as investment continues in this, particularly if there are benefits to the use of AGI for some system that either give us a tactical edge in trade or military projection. And seeing that down the line and how humanity has yet to figure out how to get out of that kind of arms race trap, it's hard to be optimistic about that not being worshipped as some false god to solve a problem that we can't even define.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's definitely the whole geopolitical aspect of it is strange, and not even given the all the stuff they keep claiming about the last election, but like just I mean some of the hysteria around deep fakes. If you think about you take deep fakes plus what was that ransomware stuff, and then you got you take footage of someone pulled from a public database, and you mix it with some pornography or them doing something causing a crime or committing a crime rather, or just doing something saying something particularly insulting, and then you already link by having hacked their Gmail account or something. You threaten to send that off as you sort of holding them hostage or whatever by or blackmail rather, is the sort of using artificially generated footage, or even just ransoming based on doing like a neural net analysis of all the emails that they've sent and all the different scenarios where you could say I would reveal information X or Y to different parties, and then sending them those threats, and they pay in Bitcoin, of course, because that would be or some crypto, and sort of the rising risk of that particular, and then the sort of the culmination of all that is the crypto, the sort of darknet crypto hit markets or whatever. There's like for hated politicians or something. I think there was a Black Mirror episode actually that touched on stuff like that. But just the fact that a nation could potentially carry out or something with access to a lot of supercomputers, GPUs, that sort of thing.
Well, I don't think that's going to matter that much in the future, just because you're
nations as a threat against other nations.
I think you're just going to have so many of those types of videos that.
Oh, you're absolutely right. That is the end
people
result.
Are just going to make up their mind on whatever basis that they want to. Which is pretty.
That ultimately is the good,
scary.
Because it would flood the market, and so you'd even have instances where it probably was a compromising footage of someone that then becomes useless. So like.
So political manipulation will happen on
Trump or
a level even beyond that.
Political, yeah, which you wonder that'll happen as a transition in the populace, the sort of mind of the it would be when their credulity or whatever as applied to
well,
video
so
evidence or what.
God, so I feel like this is one sort of
yeah,
line.
you were talking about the geopolitics,
right?
That was
and
like
this is an interesting topic, and
general AI, what it would do to people.
Well,
right?
So it's really interesting if you think about the confluence of different like states that the different you can think about it as the four main civilizations, the four industrialized civilizations are going through right now, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
You could talk about Western civilization, broadly defined, is let's call it three. So Western civilization, broadly defined, is the United States, Europe, Japan, and Korea.
Okay.
Yeah. Huh?
Okay. Number 2.
Russia. Right.
All right.
Russia is its own thing, right? And it's not really civilizations; it's just people with conflicting interests, right? And similar levels of power. And then you have China. Well, China is in this interesting state where they're sort of like where the United States was in the early 20th century, where the U.S. was ready to say, "Hey, we're the U.S." and the British no longer control this hemisphere at all, and we're actually the predominant power. And the Chinese have this deep cultural insecurity that goes back to the late 19th century when they felt like the Europeans took over their society and dictated much of what they did, leading to the decades-long Civil War and all the things that happened after that.
And that's why we remember Empire Day, which is the day where we try to remember the names of all the men from the town of Sudbury who so gallantly gave their lives to keep China British.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Never mind. Monty Python's Meaning of Life. There's just this line that they put in with the whole. It's the church scene with they're talking about the school cormorant. They've been rubbing linseed oil into the school cormorant.
Okay, right. Please keep over explaining this.
Carry on.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Admittedly, I've only read one book about this, so it's not like something I've studied really deeply or anything. But I know that the Chinese government is like reinstituting nationalism. They're using nationalism to an extent that that a lot of Western countries can't get away with anymore. They're using it to really create a level of consensus to dictate the actions of their government to an extent that in the West we pretty much can't get away with. And then the Russians are obviously just Russians and they can get away with that. So in the context, if you think about,
you're counting Russia as definitely not the West, the way you right?
No, there's no way that they could be, right?
Or because it's sort of it's the another white Russian dude, right? It's kind of a gradient country between East and West, right?
There's a difference between the population and the geopolitics of the country as a whole, and I think Edwin was trying to define like the world outlooks for the three main groups of West, Russia, China, and then I think he had a question we haven't gotten to.
Well, it's just I don't know if it's even a question as much as a framework to get thoughts on, but it's in the context of artificial general intelligence and these three societies basically competing to be the first one there. What you were talking about is actually particularly concerning in terms of building the armies of divine beings. I mean, I don't know if you want to call it that, but that's pretty much an inevitable path. And especially with some of the life extension technologies that we're seeing right now, I could expect someone like Vladimir Putin to be in power for another 20 years.
Yeah, with that Peter Thiel blood of the young, right? He's got a blood boy that's just following him around and just to help the young buck to.
And the Chinese guy, he's relatively young, but he's used anti-corruption campaigns to pretty much purge all of his contenders to power. So he's actually consolidated power in a way that I can't think of another recent Chinese head of state has been able to do. So you're going to have people with relatively ossified ideas about bringing their countries, restoring the glory of their respective civilizations, really taking actions to that end. And the West is necessarily going to be reactionary.
So you bring up an interesting point there, because in Russia and China, there is a sense of return to empire, right? But in the West, we don't have that sense of return to empire. We still have a shame from empire because we did it for a long time. I mean, do you think that the Brits are going to be saying that they want to restore Britain to the glory of the height of the British Empire?
Not in the same way, but there is a rejection of the idea that we should reject our colonial past. I think actually that's
a rejection.
Yeah, I think that's actually part of the reactionary movements we see on the right.
Interesting.
So it's not just the alt-right where they say embrace the ethno-state. I think there's, so to speak, alt-light that says let's embrace our past, like despite all the things our ancestors have done that weren't savory, let's consider it in the broader context of what people were doing in society at the time. And, you'll have people argue things like, well, white people also got rid of slavery before other people did, so we should get credit for that, et cetera, et cetera.
That's the Proud Boys, right? The Gavin McInnes.
I don't know. I don't pay attention to these people.
Yeah, of course not.
But I just know that these ideas are out there. I couldn't take time to listen to Gavin McInnes.
I would say there is something amusing about the fact that he would be considered the sort of hipster, the hipster in the coal mine, if you will. That sort of is when whichever direction he happens to be going, it seems to be this whatever it's a sort of cultural trend that then gets picked up. Because Vice would be an early example of like this very kind of rebel but media presence where they would go places where they just like give a guy a camera, or at least this was the image that it was sold.
They still do that,
and I mean.
They they actually just push agendas for things like climate change, and people get angry at them for that.
Right, yeah, because there's a whole political party that one of the two that denies climate change.
Not real.
Okay, so I think there's an interesting separate conversation to be had about how different peoples, for lack of a better term, get to decide what to include in their heritage. Because we don't really have a great way of determining what that cultural corpus is. Because you could also say that punk music is white heritage.
Right.
But at the same time, a lot of white people don't like punk music and don't want that to be part of their heritage.
Right.
So we don't have standards for that conversation. But I think that's an entirely different hole to go down. We were talking about AGI and geopolitics, and should probably return to that.
Sure.
So then the question to me becomes, how do each of these spheres of civilizational thought, what are their incentives for and against AGI? How is it something that helps them build their vision of themselves? And how can they defend it from competition from the other civilizations?
I know that like chess and then later Go, and then they kind of went back and with AlphaGo also ace chess as well. It was I think it was a transfer learning thing, or they met some goal and it involved chess as well as involving, and it's just I think they just used the rules of chess and trained on nothing but fighting itself or something like that. But they're one of the recent sort of milestones with, if not general intelligence, certainly artificial intelligence of a sort of measurable caliber would be the AlphaGo victory, and that I think has an East and West element. I mean, Go as a game, not that I know a lot about Go, but I mean, just looking at the sort of whimsicalness and level of sort of diversity of elements in chess, and then that leads to a combinatorially restricted, way restricted space. But also more, you know, it has you know, different kind of disjointed complexity to it as well. But ultimately, then it just in terms of enumerating it, Go has way more of these possibilities that ultimately. So it was considered a further out test of sort of the rule-based enumerating on a, you know, small simulated universe, discrete universe type games. These things that ultimately evolved in different cultures as you know, like just like games of physical sport games. It was something where you appreciated it because you'd played the same game yourself and you realized how hard it was, football or chess or whatever.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused. So
so I'm saying that's a East and West. There's definitely Go. The fact that the best East Asian Go player had been defeated was, you know, when they beat the best Western Go player.
But the question was about
that wasn't
different
as big of a
cultural narratives.
About the progression of artificial general intelligence, and you're talking about geopolitical spheres. So yes. I thought,
well, not only that, but what the different incentives are given the different cultural narratives,
right?
To both compete and to cooperate. Right.
So it would seem that the more east you go, like I know that China recently invested like multiple billions, I think, or hundreds of millions in a quantum computing center, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Tsinghua University is doing really well in terms of
And they talked about there was, and I can't speak to the reality of this or usefulness of this, but I mean, if they really do have a quantum radar, that geopolitics change. If we can't put a stealth thing anywhere, that suddenly it's things are a little bit more even.
I don't know that it changes to the extent that
we do a lot of stuff where they're just like, well, that building's not there anymore, and now it was because we put a B2 over there.
So so the possibility of that, and so like this is the interesting thing, right? So this guy at Harvard wrote a really interesting book recently. It was because is war with China inevitable? And he talked about whether. So do you know what Thucydides' trap is?
When was this written? Sorry.
Explain Thucydides' trap, please.
So Thucydides' trap is when you have a civilization that's reached a zenith that is declining, and another civilization that is on the way up. And obviously there's like a fear there, right? So the civilization, and this is purely economic, right? So it's not even in terms of culture or whatever. It's just ability to exert economic influence. And the question is the civilization that's already met its zenith in terms of economic and therefore general influence, is it going to be afraid of the civilization that's on the rise and is obviously going to surpass it at some point? And is a civilization that's on the rise going to be afraid that the civilization that's already reached the zenith is going to suppress its growth? And typically what's happened in the past, not always, but in some instances, you have war due to the mutual fear that exists in both of those societies. So you had the same
like
thing
cohabiting. Are they just adjacent? Is like France and England and Spain?
No, like the reason it's called Thucydides' trap is because it actually happened between Athens and Sparta, and they had a war for 30 years that just completely. It actually set Western civilization back probably for millennia, because I mean those two civilizations were at the top of Western civilization at the time, and they spent because of mutual fear.
Scale, right? You think?
Excuse me?
I mean, in terms of a setback, well, I mean, multiple millennia. When was it? Was it like?
This is. Go ahead, Sandra.
I think the idea there is that if Athens and Sparta hadn't been so decimated by fighting each other, they couldn't have been subsumed by Roman states that were ascendant a couple of centuries later.
Gotcha. Right. The Romans showed up and And,
Yep.
But just in terms of cultural development,
about that?
I mean, obviously, there's millennia. It's an odd way to put it, but in terms of the cultural development that was happening in Athens and Sparta at the time, and then the time it took for Europe and all the bullshit really that Europe went through, religion, et cetera, over that time, a lot of that could have been escaped if those societies didn't completely fall because of the Peloponnesian War. So that's the argument. It's obviously hard to speak in counterfactuals, but
does he have any cases of that not happening?
I mean, I'm just trying to think of another example of it.
I mean, the United States and Britain, it didn't happen then. But I mean, there are obviously countervailing factors. So the Brits actually talked about the fact that that maybe they should have intervened during the U.S. Civil War, because if the Confederacy had won and there was actually a split, they could have exerted more influence on the North American continent. But some of their diplomats actually say, these opportunities do not come more than once to an empire, and we did not take advantage of it. So
that's pretty
at the time.
That is Empire 101, right? To fund when you're splitting up your enemies or your internal. Yeah.
No, and there's a lot of stuff that's really interesting about this. I don't want to go down that tangent, but in terms of the current dynamics that we're seeing, go ahead, Xander.
I was going to say, bring back Thucydides' trap to AGI in terms of your question.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're saying I should?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but I think, like we saw with the British, like we saw with the British, where they did not fight with the United States, there were two reasons. First of all, the Americans were just way too powerful, and they realized that they couldn't win a war, even if they could be subversive in some ways to maintain some of their power. But also the Germans, right? They understood that they would be better cooperating with the U.S. against the Germans. With the three states, there's a lot of economic dependency, and there's also there's the threat of mutually assured destruction. So when it comes to artificial general intelligence, there isn't a sense of, if this society gets it before the other, our society is going to completely collapse. However, politicians also don't understand computer science. Right? No. Right? So if there's a fear that is literally building an army of divine beings, you could actually see some really irrational decisions being made on that basis, especially without communication and similar cultural contexts between the different civilizations.
Just because you're saying it would just be the visual or the imagining,
just the fear of the other
process,
just the fear of the other. Like these Marxists are going to have,
or the infinite.
No, just these Marxists are going to have more.
Oh, Marxists! I thought we were
just
talking
it's
about
just
AGI.
like China, whose government pretty much controls everything, and we're American and we like liberty.
Marxist, right? A Marxist would say they're not Marxist. Right?
Okay, so they're Maoists because they're actually they're doing intentional Maoist indoctrination, even though they're not strictly speaking communists. But the point is that, considering the fear that the different civilizations have about the different modes of self-organization, just that fear alone might be a basis for people to compete, even if it doesn't actually lead to any tangible, like the advantages may not be as significant as we would think, right? Because
the advantages to
having AGI before other societies, because you're not going to completely destroy another society because you have artificial general intelligence before they do. It doesn't
be that intelligent,
right? What?
It wouldn't be that intelligent to do that. I mean, unless I think what the rationalists are worried about is more like some scenario where there's like with the nukes race, the arms race, where that's like both sides aren't communicating enough to coordinate. Like, okay, let's all not generate. So they're all worried. What are the other guys doing? Oh, we got to build more. There's going to be an AI gap or something, and then we're going to make some demon that'll eat everything.
But that was actually more rational back then, because those countries had literally fought each other and threatened the well-being of each other, right? And they'd actually seen the Americans drop nuclear weapons and the implications of that. But in this context, we're going to have been coordinating in a global economy for a really long time. So it's not the fear isn't as rational, but the ideological fear is going to be very real.
Okay, so of the three spheres of influence you've defined, Russia is the least economically dependent upon anyone else.
Right.
So that gets interesting. Part of this conversation being difficult is because we haven't laid out what we are assuming the AGI will be endowed with in terms of actual real-world capacities. There's a huge difference between the AI McDonald's and an AI nuclear submarine.
Right.
Kind of a big scary. But if you look at just where culture is right now, like with Russia, they would probably never confirm the existence of it. There would be rumors of that kind of system existing. It would be very much in the realm of black ops, and it would never be entirely clear what was going on with it. Whereas I think with the nationalism, patriotism blend that you could have going, that you described in China, after there was something proven, the reveal of it would be seen as a nationalistic pride. But in the West,
a similar thing could happen to Vladimir Putin, though, don't you think?
It depends on what it is. So, like, what kind of power is it endowed with? That's the big question for me.
That's true.
What would we do here?
That's big open-ended question.
It depends on who's in power. If it's Trump, he might have.
Wait, what if Trump is evidence that AGI already took over, and it's slowly, it's like the aliens making themselves aware?
Trump is evidence of a lot of things.
I don't know if the word intelligence is in any of those things.
It is. It's preceded by certain negating prefixes.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
No. Well, okay.
Language is a state space. Opposites of contiguous in state space.
Of course. Okay. Back on topic, though. So let's make some assumption about tactically what these are being endowed with, because we're talking about the cultural fears of armies of divine beings made up of AGI as geopolitics, but to actually ground that, we need to assume that there's some capability that this has. So, Edwin, do you want to throw something out there?
Well, that's the thing that's so hard with this, right? I mean,
okay,
so you can only speculate. I mean, the thing is, so you can say
speculation is a form of computation, and if we had the ability to simulate one of these things, really, then we would have it. So,
I mean, so the big thing is what the best way of thinking about it is what military capability would you like to have? Okay, so you can have that thing with AGI, right?
Okay.
I mean,
okay, all right, let's do some magic. In that case, let's go with the example we were talking about a little bit earlier, about stealth technology no longer working,
right?
About endowing some form of quantum radar or whatever with the capacity to discriminate cloaked objects greater than before. So stealth is gone. How does that change geopolitics?
It makes it easier for China to take over Taiwan, something like that.
Oh lordy!
Right.
It means people are surprised more often because cloaked military buildups and moving around of supplies become something you can't monitor via satellites to the same degree that you could. Or rather, you have perfect knowledge. I'm sorry, I was thinking completely the wrong direction. Said the inverse of what I meant. You have perfect knowledge of where troop buildups are happening. How does that change it?
Also, potentially, if you're ahead of the curve, you could also never be detected, right? So it goes both ways.
Oh,
which would probably be the ultimate military advantage, right?
Some sort of way of quantum radar securing your. I would wonder what a vessel like that would actually look like, because the surface would have to, in some way, have. I mean, you would need entanglement at a very large scale. there'd be, or there's probably some. I don't know, but quantum radar right now, it's basically pushing radar accuracy. It would be. I mean, I haven't seen any of the numbers on this one from China or whatever. But if it's real, if they have the thing, then radar accuracy goes way past like the noise floor, or what would normally be the noise floor for any big installation. And so when you normally, you just try to minimize the sort of return, electromagnetic EM return of the directed signals at the plane. You just want to not have. You just want to have no right angles, right? So you have to sort of compute a surface that does that, and then you have to have material that absorbs, a lot of radar signals and all this other shit. But ultimately, you're just reducing the signature size, right, from any angle that you care about. Maybe like directly above or below. It's not, but like from the side, you're making it so that there's no reflection that'll come back to the source, no retroreflection, or minimizing the retroreflection from any useful angles. And when you do that, you never have zero. There's never like a perfect zero of so it's basically your quantum radar is able to take advantage of the emitted stuff. I mean, there's certain, you might be able to do this with sound and other weird stuff, because there might be like a phonon theory of gases, because it turns out there is one of this. But anyway, I'm off on a tangent. But the quantum radar thing would basically mean that we wouldn't be able to fly missions of certain types without asking permission of everyone in between, which we, like get Pakistan to have their government together enough to agree to like let us fly over the thing, to not have some, what I mean, where there's all this stuff that we just do in the background right now that runs smoothly, I guess. I mean, until it doesn't, but that relies on the fact that once you've got a plane that's built like that, it doesn't get detected by it. You just fly it high enough that it will never, no one knows that it's there. You can fly it over China, fly it over anyone. So, I mean, that's a big deal, right? That changes a whole bunch of, it's sort of, though it's one of those, it's kind of like the finding out about the blackmail, being the sort of market for blackmail material in politics going out the window, or being market saturated by deep fakes material. And so it's like the change is hard to anticipate, because it was an off the books thing that was happening anyway by nature of it. So it's a lot of these hidden things being uncovered in sort of and you don't know what the reaction will be, because you don't know what was hidden. It was by nature of it being hidden. So that, unfortunately, geopolitics, a lot of the reason geopolitics is so batshit all the time is because there's so much of that stuff, behind the scenes stuff, that you just kind of have to talk about in terms of statistics and sort of, who's mad at who and stuff. I've never been.
Well, obviously you don't know what's happening a lot of times. There's a lot of really interesting books about what we've done in the past, and they can inform how to think about it more succinctly.
Chomsky can definitely ring off
Not just Chomsky. There's a lot of.
But he's good at that, of being like, by the way, the Nicaraguans, we funded the beheading militias that then,
Chomsky's good for what Chomsky is, but there's also a lot of other things that I think give you context about what's happening beyond the perspective of an academic. And it's good to be able to hold both of those perspectives in your mind simultaneously if you're going to develop an accurate understanding of geopolitics, I think.
Okay.
It's the hallmark of an enlightened mind.
So what you've basically concluded is that AGI and geopolitical hands will lead to a new degree of transparency, where people can not conceal as much as they could previously. And what you're mentioning, Paul, about things being in the background in diplomacy, now those things are out in the open and incontrovertible.
Leaks.
It's not even necessarily a leak at that point. It's more just everybody has knowledge of where different military installations are, so you can't.
I'm really sorry to
kind of look anymore.
About that thing that just happened with the running, the little running. There was some device that would, and they found all these hidden military bases, U.S. military bases, because there were people jogging.
Oh yeah.
The company released their. I'm sorry, it was just so relevant. All right. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay, for I guess I guess there might be in the audience like 3 people are going to watch this. Okay, for people who haven't seen that, there is a news story that soldiers going for jogs and tracking their jog routes via this app wound up revealing the internal structure and location of multiple military bases.
Wow.
Because the company kind of released the jogging data and didn't think to clear it beforehand of things that maybe weren't supposed to be known.
And,
It's pretty. It's as competent as the U.S. military is, and they really are. Some of the people in the U.S. military are some of the most enlightened individuals that we have in our society. It's really impressive. No, seriously.
Sure. I couldn't tell if you were being sarcastic or not. I agree. I
mean, I'm not one of those like anti-U.S. people. I think there's nuance.
No, but I could also see why that would be a sarcastic, like, because the closed-mindedness. I just saw the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats, which is right up the same alley of the psychedelic adjacent, or the sort of hippie open consciousness adjacent to the military. What if it was, or not what if, it literally happened, and it kind of, MK Ultra is the really dark side of that. But like, what if you had military rigor alongside the path to enlightenment, Jeff Bridges.
Well, that's the idea.
Whatever he personifies.
I mean, that's supposed to be. Anyway.
Go ahead. Yeah.
It's just funny sometimes to see the incompetence that really competent organizations can exude. That's all.
The thing is, this isn't incompetence. This is technology taking them by surprise. And it just underscores how technology can surprise us in ways we don't understand. And this isn't even AGI. This is a fucking app company that tracks your job. So
it is weird. But how do you even cover for something like that other than just?
You can't.
I guess Google has this system they have where they assume all network traffic is in different layers of.
I'm sure you could cover for that specifically, but
got a cool name.
But how do you cover for
anticipate it?
Yeah, exactly. There are a bunch of different events.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's cool.
Yeah, and it just underscores how Internet of Things is a flaming pile of insecure crap.
They've just started bricking them. I heard that recently the like, and it's like a superhero. Like it reminds me of like Harry Tuttle, heating engineer or whatever from the movie Brazil, where he everything has become so incompetent and so bureaucratic that it's actually the hero who flies in to save the day has to illegally repair the air conditioner. That's his heroic act, is fixing a basic appliance. And now they've got appliances being turned into botnets, and now finding a way to hack the botnet to brick the appliances if they can't be updated, there's just no capacity for firmware updates. That is a heroic act. So it's like a gray hat or arguably white hat if they're being used for botnet things. That's just that implies such an insane level of incompetence at so many levels. Yeah, but many layers, and it's a level. But
it's going to happen to self-driving cars at some point.
What?
It's going to happen to a fleet of self-driving cars at some point.
Oh God.
So I was actually talking to Keenan about this yesterday, which it's a little tangent, but it's pretty interesting. So you would figure Tokyo would be the first city to just integrate self-driving cars into their grid and be pretty much ubiquitous because of how efficient. Did you know Tokyo has 25 million people?
Yeah.
That's
crazy.
Yeah,
it's a mega city.
I didn't know that. It's insane to me. But apparently their unions are so strong.
Oh, it's called Beyond Corp. I was talking about the Google enterprise security model that has this zero trust networks. It's built in, like you assume that all your data is. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry. Beyond Corp.
Just with self-driving cars, you would expect that Tokyo would be one of the cities that would be the first to integrate it. But Keenan is actually saying that's probably not going to be the case because of the strength of their unions. So
it is crazy, the automobile industry, all the way down to the dealer level. There's just this not monopoly, but it's just assumed cars are now an extension of being. Everyone will always have, it's like a haircut or something. That's just never going to change. They just in the last century.
Well, I think so. Japan is going to be really interesting because they do everything so well. But in terms of like, if our economy is going to look different because of some of the technologies that will be coming on board in the near future, Japan will probably lead the way in terms of what societies could look like if it actually does become that much of a burden.
What becomes that much of a burden?
Uh,
The unions, the self-driving cars.
No. Technology. To capitalism.
You mean like we'll turn into like a hive?
Just automation.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. Nothing too complex here.
Hmm.
I think they're a little bit more. They're not like the Scandinavian countries in many ways at all. I think their economies are closer to the United States. They're like more friendly to corporations. Although they're not. They don't. It's different for them because they don't have like a startup scene where a lot of young companies start and become mega companies and die. They have more of these like really old companies that have relationships with government that a lot of people work for. But it's going to be interesting to see how they deal with that. I think they could be a model. They do everything really well.
Sorry.
I mean, what? they even have a better form of incel than we do.
What's incel?
Involuntarily celibate.
Excuse me?
So you're familiar with MGTOWs, right?
MGTOW.
I've seen the acronym, but I'm not sure what it represents.
It's like the lizards who've become they reproduce asexually now.
I heard about that.
Divergent lineage that will be ultimately terminal in every instance. But
terminal.
So
MGTOW are the men going their own way.
Yeah.
Hold on 1 second. I'll be right back.
You brought up MGTOW, man. This is on
I know
you.
I did. That's fine. It's totally fine that I did. I was just saying that in terms of Edwin's point, the vegetable men in Japan are, I think, a better kind of incel than we have here.
I think it's herbivore, right? Herbivore.
Yeah, herbivore. Vegetable men. I'm not sure exactly the exact translation, but just I think being chill and playing video games all day is a far better use of one's choice than being a raging asshole to everyone around them.
Oh, I think everyone around them would agree, right?
Some people would argue that the two aren't disconnected.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
But are you going off audio from Xbox Live or
off what? What do you mean?
Audio. Oh, just how gamers can also be obnoxious to everyone around them.
Or just like if you don't have something that you're working towards in life, then you end up being an asshole.
If you haven't gamified life properly, is that what you have to gamify at it's like main, the highest level function in the then you gamify it. Oh yeah, then it's acceptable. But I wonder if it's like constrained, given the lack or the decreasing sphere of possibilities for the near future of certain generations that have this negative reputation. I think given the and the debt crisis, the student debt crisis and stuff, it's understandable that people would then turn to other distractions. It's the same. I think I mentioned this. I think I mentioned it on the last podcast. But you don't give the young men a coming of age, they'll return to the village and burn it to the ground.
I don't think it's even a matter of the society we live in. I think video games are just fun.
Not society, maybe the time in society. Oh yeah, they're a super stimulus or whatever.
Yeah, actually, I think in any society, if people have access to really awesome video games, a bunch of dudes are going to spend a lot of time playing it, like regardless of what it's structured like.
Just games in general, game, not even video games, but like just even chess. There's a gender bias in gamifying in little simulated versions of things where
especially
you do
young
it's
people.
Not clear you get a return, a very good return. Men tend to be more. It's less of a sure thing, and it's more of a kind of a long shot type way to actually have a sustainable. Anyway, so it's the risky strategy would be the unintended gender split. But anyway.
Okay, so we don't know how to discuss AGI and geopolitics, so let's try a different tack.
I think we sort of took that as far as we could.
I think so for now.
There's no sort of conclusions with those sorts of topics. It's just sort of exposing the different.
There really isn't. We could write down some context and make some lists, but that's about it.
Yeah.
The conclusion would be the AGI showing up and us seeing what the fuck happens.
Yeah. All right, so let's try AGI in a different context. What about AGI as a personal demon? In the sense, not in the sense of that it's haunting you and torturing you, but in the sense of a...
Why not a computer?
I mean, if that's what you're into and you're a masochist, go for it. Have fun. All the fun you want. But what about the idea of AGI as a cover for zero economic prospects, of zero jobs, of subsisting on a universal basic income that barely gets you by, but we can give you this little AI demon that's always your companion and creates the perfect VR game world for you to escape to ignore how shitty your life actually is?
Well, I mean, so this is a really interesting question, because what if the VR game world? So this is a really interesting ethical question. What if the VR game world actually isn't just an escape? What if it allows you and gives you the tools to actually have an existence where you can experience deep well-being and not just dopamine hits, right? Because that's also possible as we understand how consciousness works. Is that unethical? That's like,
I would say no, because like look at Minecraft. I mean, it's a simple fucking game. It's not difficult to understand, but there's not really like a winning thing. It's like, look at what I built. Look at what I made.
Minecraft once, right?
Right. Or, so like basically virtual anarcho-syndicalism. That's how I would think about it, right?
I like fully automated luxury communism. Is the
personal reality.
Or it doesn't have to be so personal, but completely voluntarist, and where people can actually really work on skills that they're developing. Obviously, there are all sorts of weird things, right, where you don't necessarily get the fruits that you would normally. You don't get all the girls necessarily, right?
No.
Or the societal recognition, or maybe even that's possible. But actually being able to experience eudaimonia virtually, like, how does that? Like, what does that mean for society?
I mean, I think we already see that in like Paul's fantasies of being a YouTube star.
That's true. These delusions, they run down to the core of my being, and they offer me this glimpse at a connection that is otherwise unavailable.
Yeah. You can share your body with the world.
That's true.
Just a better much better version of Snow Crash, of the metaverse.
Have you finished Snow Crash yet, Edwin?
No, I'm close.
Okay, good job.
It's a hard one. Anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Xander, what do you think of the Slate Star Codex rationalist community? Well, the less wrong rationalists, the MIRI Machine Intelligence Research Institute, Peter Thiel funded, interestingly, kind of that sphere. They branched off, or there's like this kind of diaspora that followed this blogger, Scott Siskind, and he's kind of doing his own, or Scott Alexander is doing his own kind of take on the rationalist community. I mean, do you know what I'm talking about? First of all, Slate Star Codex, or is that completely, because Edwin mentioned it on a podcast?
I know the very high level. What you mean? There were some interesting essays on there. I appreciate that there are people who are trying to participate in a rationalist debate and lay out their assumptions at a high quality level. And I appreciate their intentions. Trying to find ways to be rational and altruistic is a great endeavor. I'm glad that they're spending some of their free time and wealth doing so. That's great. That being said, I don't have 100 hours to spend on going through the canon to have a more nuanced opinion as to the actual ideology.
Right.
You don't want to know about the 3 to the up arrow, up arrow, up arrow, the Knut's up arrow notation 3?
He may have some more interesting things.
That how many Knut's up arrow 3 dust specks in eyes counts as viciously torturing someone for a solid year? Because that's the sort of ethical question that we really need to tackle, given all the difficulty in the world.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
No, okay.
Yeah.
So that's actually is an example of what you were just, because there's this whole kind of backstory required. But basically, there was this debate about whether how many dust specks in the eye in people's eyes counts as a horrible moral travesty or whatever, torturing some or killing an animal. How many dust specks, like? At what point are you okay?
You just have to prioritize.
Yeah,
that's the thing. Yeah, it's almost kind of like too much enumeration of some of these things.
It's just way too much.
That seems like counting blades of grass.
Yeah.
To embody your logos, you have to prioritize.
Ah.
We are finite beings. Perhaps it's our very ability to contemplate the infinite and yet recognize our finitude, whatever the finiteness.
So the conversation. Okay, so this we might be able to make some at least take somewhere for a long enough period of time.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go, guys. We can do it.
Do it.
So, I had an interesting conversation with Edwin Boyette yesterday, right? And what are you doing?
Yeah, yesterday.
Yeah.
The other day. Yeah, yesterday I had another conversation.
No,
I saw your,
yeah. Anyway, we didn't record it or anything. It was just a conversation. But so, like, he's a pretty smart guy, right? I mean, the decisions he makes politically are just completely irrational to me, right? Or he's first of all, he's Republican. I think republicanism is just like, I don't get it. I know that like an entire half of the spectrum label him that way seems ridiculous, but I really just don't get it. And he asked a really interesting question, which was, is beauty just a function of human perception, or is it something that exists outside of us? And like, obviously from a materialist point of view, it exists outside of us, or it's not outside of us, it's subjective. But if you really experienced it, that seems unlikely, or at least it doesn't feel that way.
You have to appeal to experience. Yeah. You do. I agree with you. There's something deeper there, but it is also indescribable, and I totally would get why it would sound like a hipster talking about how the acoustics of a vinyl album or something crazy or seemingly something easy to scoff at until you've actually lived it in maybe not, the vinyl doesn't sound different to you, but the in some one way or another had that experience of hearing stuff subtler than the noise and being like there's something else there, to use an analogy from the quantum radar.
Or it's even like, it can even be more fundamental, right? If you meditate for long enough and you just see the world as beautiful, like devoid of any context, right?
Well, I think how people define beauty is one of the interesting ways to understand how they see the world and themselves. I've noted that a lot of people who are politically conservative don't see something as beautiful unless they can also see that many hours of work have been invested into its creation. Like, they tend to think that the old masters of marble, like the guy who made Laocoon, I should remember the artist, but I don't right now, that's the epitome of art. And like, that's been a strain of art criticism for like a really, really long time. That the amount of effort and skill that went into it is the equivalent of beauty. But then, like in postmodernism with liberalism, beauty is that which brings people joy. It's an entirely subjective experience. It's kind of a rejection of the idea that there's this authority of work that goes into beauty. So asking someone how they understand beauty is one of those questions that can kind of get at to the core of who they are. And like for me personally, a long time ago, I arrived at a very compact definition of beauty, and just simply that beauty is that which brings me joy. Nothing more is needed.
I mean, but it's that nothing more is needed, or like that.
Nothing more is needed for you, I suppose, right?
Exactly. Nothing more is needed for me.
Yeah.
I feel
If you
no
wanted-
need to complicate the concept of beauty with other conditions or definitions or contexts.
It's a
No
personal
need.
definition
No need.
that
Right.
works completely given that it's personal to you within your universe. But then if
Exactly.
you tried to generalize a definition like that, which I'm not saying you're trying to do, your definition is accurate. It's 100%. That's what beauty is.
Well, it has implications, right?
If you tried to generalize, though, you would end up with shit that you really liked that brought some people no joy or took away their joy, right? I know I'm stating the obvious, right? And you're in agreement. But then take it another level and say, well, what if you're trying to take beauty, like what, do you have a version of beauty that would work for both you and for like a notorious serial killer, or like that would work, not that it necessarily, maybe it's already working for it, no, but that basically you can't, the notorious serial killer, if he's brought intense joy and pleasure by, although I suppose beauty wouldn't necessarily be moralized in that case, or shouldn't be, right? And so it's beauty as
devoid of morality, yeah.
Right. So beauty as proof of work. So I guess you could still do a serial killer. You could be like, wow, you must get up early in the morning. Or the Eddie Izzard, like, I guess he was talking about mass genocide and stuff. But the point being that, right. But okay, a more benign proof of work in beauty would be like frills, frilly parts of clothing that tend to be frilled are precisely the parts of clothing that tend to wear in a noticeable way. When you like, so you're basically saying, haha, fuck you, I can have like a fractal pattern in precisely the place that's going to wear down first, because I can signal, I have handmaidens or whatever bullshit, or have materials available that make it look like I have, that's sort of the modern, the 90s, I guess would be sort of, or the last century really, but to see sort of beauty represented as a common, almost inextricable combination of proof of work and then I guess proof of talent would be, because like there's jazz. So what you were describing was classical music being more of the proof of, there was a whole bunch of effort that went into this. A whole bunch of people had to train together. So they all had to get into a room, train at the same time, and then they also trained a bunch on their own. And then the thing was written by a guy who, he wasn't writing it live. He had to write it in a over the course of a long period of time. So the proof of work in that instance, whereas jazz would be purely a proof of talent. Whereas it's supposed to be a flow. It's effortless. Those are both beautiful. They're certainly beautiful to me. I mean, music just has this range of ways of portraying probably purely mathematical beauty in the end. But there are aspects of it that are proof of work, and there are aspects of it that are proof of talent. And it's not clear which is which if you get down to fine, neuroanatomy and stuff like that. But do you see what I mean? Where basically what you were describing was whatever causes you joy. That's personal, hyper personal. But if you try to generalize it, it's hard to immediately because then there'll be things that are beautiful to other people that are specifically the opposite. So there would be a contradiction to generalize it directly. So if you tried to have a definition that worked for everyone, then it would involve sort of assigning some weighted, something might be beautiful. If it is a proof of work, so it's very hard to do, but then to be a proof of work, it's easily consumed, or so hard to do, easy to prove, or easy to consume in a way that shows you, demonstrates that there was work that went into it. And then, or, easy to consume and demonstrate that there's talent that went into it. So jazz, I know, is partly signaling to other people who are musically gifted. And so there's sort of if you're completely tone deaf, or if you're completely tone deaf, people can still enjoy music, but often they won't enjoy certain types of complex improvisational music, because there's like improv has moments of faltering, and then recovering from the faltering is in and of itself a proof of further talent and work. And in the moment, look, I resolved this, what was probably a mistake, but now doesn't look like it in retrospect, because it was matched by the tempo and tones of the music that followed. So it's sort of the spontaneity is one half of the sort of beauty spectrum. If we're just restrict it to music, I guess, and then concert music would be at the opposite end, and yet still beautiful, still potentially both could make people cry and stuff. So, you know,
I mean,
that
but
is-
do you
that would be
know
a-
people who
make
don't
stuff-
find fractals
Correct.
beautiful?
Find what?
Fractals.
Are you saying? Do I know someone who doesn't
Yeah.
find them beautiful? What'd you
Yeah.
say?
Do you know anyone who doesn't find fractals?
It would be like someone who like didn't like laughter or didn't like. I could sort of see didn't like humor, but just like there's almost a Patton. There's a Patton Oswalt bit about it because it's almost so.
You guys
tropish.
keep going. I'll be back in just a moment.
All right. It's so tropish to be, or just like, or it's rather it's a ridiculous concept, and so it's a source of humor to be like, oh, there's someone who doesn't love to laugh. It would be like, I think the Patton Oswalt joke was making fun of obituaries, saying, oh, he loved to laugh. Oh, well, who doesn't love to laugh, right? You know, oh, he hungered for food. Oh, you know,
So is that an exception to something that is generalizable?
What do you mean?
Well, you're saying that you can't generalize beauty because often what people perceive as beautiful are in contradiction to each other.
You could
However-
probably still generalize it. You just wouldn't be able to generalize his version. That's what I mean.
Well, I mean,
It's still a correct definition of beauty. That's beauty for
How
him.
so?
And it's because it only works for
if
him.
the ultimate end is to come to a conclusion on whether it exists outside of us or is
Mhm.
entirely subjective,
Oh,
then
then
it's-
yeah, no, it's not a.
then
You're right.
excuse
yeah.
me. Then,
It's
right.
not a, you're right. It's not a correct. It doesn't answer our question, our original
But
question.
is fractal is the exception?
Fractals, I would say that the mathematical, the sort of reducibility of, so having a very, very, I think if you look at the Wikipedia page for Kolmogorov complexity, it's so like just one of these ways of highly generalizing the definition of complexity, whatever whatever that can mean in a particular instance. Because like a random string could be highly complex because it's impossible to compress if it's random, and then the degree
I
of.
mean, I understand what
compressibility-
fractals are on a really broad level, and we don't need to define it mathematically.
No,
but
I was saying that the Wikipedia article for Kolmogorov complexity has a fractal, or actually has the Mandelbrot set, I think, as the image. And the reason is when you have something that's insanely unpackable, but stems from a tiny, a couple definitions of mathematical things and then one equation, then just cycled over and over. And whether any one point on the complex plane diverges or converges as initial points for this particular equation, very simple equation, that's what determines the boundary of the Mandelbrot set and the coloration if they colorize it. That's like the rate of divergence. But the boundary is a fractal for the Mandelbrot set, and part of the reason for that is as you zoom in on that convergence or divergence of that initial complex number that's determined by that point on that boundary that you're zooming in on, you get sort of a knife edge that's because of the weirdness of the complex plane and how exponentiation and is sort of like akin to rotation and all this other weird stuff. You end up with this finer and finer grained series of kind of curves that beget curves at each surface and this sort of globular thing, but you never end up with any flat, truly flat boundaries or regions where you can say, okay, convergence is here, divergence is here, let's just draw a line. And that's the essence of fractalness, is that you can just keep zooming and zooming, and that you can define a sort of self-similarity of different scales, and it's sort of how that, but that structure comes from such a simple sort of I mean, the equation behind it is so there's like maybe 100 characters to the equation, and then the logic required to run a computer to generate the Mandelbrot set, and yet the Mandelbrot set is so complex. It's sort of similar to this: if you had a compression bomb, the zip file bomb, where you unzip the contents and it's 4 gigs, but the zip file is like a kilobyte or less. And it is using the zip algorithm to make the biggest possible recursive, usually using lots of recursion, sort of inflated thing. If you define complexity, I would say all of these definitions, all the different possible definitions of entropy and of complexity and sort of describing information in the universe, they all get at some aspect, some sort of reducibility in one direction or another of some collection of information. And so the extent to which something might be reducible visually using, whatever, like we recognize patterns, and there's going to be periodic things showing up on anything fractal. And so that's going to show up. That's just going to, it would be the same way that we find ice crystals are just crystalline things, the regularity of crystalline things, beautiful. I mean, you can even talk about the fact that we're somewhat herd animal like, and so and also somewhat eusocial, kind of like bees. And so E.O. Wilson has things to say about that. But in general, we having coordination at larger and larger scales looks intrinsically like I don't know how to put it. It would imply something about the universe's reducibility. Oh, I can predict how this system will be we're storytellers, right? And so if there's some big structured thing, we can compress it by just saying that's all like XYZ. And so if you can potentially tell a story that in someone else's brain unpacks into something much like that structure, that makes that structure more useful, even if it's really, really big, if it's like a big megalith right near where your hunter-gatherer group is. Talking about it in a somewhat mythical sense will maybe help describe its size and boundaries and which entrances to avoid, and something like that. I mean, it just I'm trying to give examples on the fly here, but in general, the reducibility and compressibility of things around us. This comes back actually to the compressive sensing question and the sort of Netflix algorithm and the requirements of sort of the backbone of the internet. But the extent to which the things around us can be compressed partly influences their value. Right? So if something is completely compressible, then it's almost valueless, because you could just, it's just a series of bits and, Do you know what I mean? Where compressibility is the thing that would make fractals. That answers your question, I think. It would be the extent to which a fractal is compressible. We sense that regularity, and that's the beautiful part. Or the thing about fractals that makes everyone go, ooh, is partly that regularity implies there's some low-level compressibility. Not that we're pulling that structure out necessarily, but we're recognizing it.
So let's twist this just a little bit. Would you then say that someone's definition of beauty has to do with their decompression algorithm for art? In the sense that not everyone can appreciate abstract art. Like I thought Rothko was full of shit for a really long time. And it took like seeing an entire gallery full of it in person to actually understand the way he was compressing space. But then you have other people who have a experiential empathy with the artists, and to them seeing mastery wrought in the form of art is where their beauty basis derives from. Appreciation of work gone into it, rather than simply appreciation of being shown something novel.
I just had to look up that artist. Sorry. It's cool.
Rothko?
It's cool.
Yeah. I'll tell you a story about that later. But then the other interesting question to me is, if we have these innate differences in how we are either natured or nurtured in the perception of beauty, beauty and truth tend to go hand in hand in a lot of people's perceptions. And in the present paradigm of increased fragmentation of reality, in terms of the lived reality that people actually can agree that they share, what's that imply for people's ability to even agree on where truth may lie and how to test it?
Petersonian, right? This is yeah. Are you Edwin? If you don't have anything, I can. Yeah. So I would say that truth as defined in part by the extent sort of a personal definition of beauty that relies on kind of the fact that give me an example. Poetic things sound more true. there's a name for that actually, right? Things that rhyme, literally people accept them more readily as true, right?
It's true.
Up to a limit, but when it gets into like Ezra Pound, they can't do it.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Well, okay. Do you mean
or Jordan Peterson?
Do you mean like so? Okay, that's the point. So the hyper fringe of, if you look at the spectrum of sort of artistic output and how people are paid, there's actually kind of a breakdown. I think a Benford's Law breakdown at the upper end of like high art, to the point where I almost wonder if a lot of that is legitimately money laundering. Clearly, I that would make so much more sense, but because it doesn't follow a nice, it doesn't but there's other things that don't do that in economics, but basically I wonder if aspects of, when you said Ezra Pound, so the extreme tail end, where it's not even, you're not even talking about rhymes, you're talking about like an essence of a feeling of, man, it's, you don't understand that it's this sort of, that you might even be capturing a relatively fleeting artistic moment, but you never can know, right, if it's out there, that far out there. But I wonder though, if recognizing that while the direct, objective, literal truth is not altered by the rhymeability of a thing, through most of our evolutionary history, the extent to which something was retainable information-wise in an unaltered or difficult to alter form, so like a checksummed form, the rhymeability of that thing actually did, or a whole, but fitting a meter also, but the whole gamut of like oration as a human activity through the millennia, that's the logos, blah blah blah. But
so you're getting demonic devices and memory palaces,
right? And that tells you something about, there's a Bayesian truth, not truth, I shouldn't say truth. There's a Bayesian reality to that. The fact that something, it's a rhymeability there, or at least there was until very recently. And now I would say that the mimetic potential is sort of the thing that we still, on some low level, I think we can still recognize how dank a meme actually truly is, sort of stuck out of time and space. That adds to our truth weighting of whatever is in the meme. Say, it's Galaxy Brain or the sort. Yeah.
So what you're getting at is kind of that people have this intuitive sense of structure, so that when information comes to them in a way that implies hidden structure, they are more willing to accept it as an intuitive truth.
Yes.
Okay.
And they're more likely to weight it in certain ways that leads to these fail states where all, people are accepting crazier and crazier things as true because they came in a really elegant package. But then it also, there's something to be said for the evolutionary eusocial potential of the fact that a music concert, the congregation of people that is coordinated to have a music concert occur, like the audience, I mean, from all the different places they have to come, and it's like certain aspects of neurology are ultimately, or certain personality types will cluster, all these things causing a microbiomic interaction, all this that is ultimately not beholden, at least not fully beholden. Lord knows they can sink their claws into it, but it is not fully beholden to the powers that be, and anyone, whatever Alex Jones villain you want to choose. There isn't there is still something magic at the core of that can't really be snuffed out, or can't be fully copied and cloned. And just because a music concert is the aspect of sort of economic viability in music, performance music, that isn't packageable, right? It would be the thing that you can still, besides like interviews with the artists or something, I don't know, but ultimately,
you're talking about
because if you can package it, then you sell it that way. What?
You're talking about the experience of mythology.
That would be in the broadest sense. Brings us back to that oration thing. That is the thing. That's kind of the term that you would ascribe to that same, like, God, I remember seeing this like Icelandic ceremony. And I was thinking about, like, when I visited Iceland, they were talking about the political, right after the economy collapsed. I just ended up stuck in this cabin with these it's like half German guy, and then his girlfriend was Icelandic, and and I was stuck in this cabin, and just because we got snowed in and we were trekking across, but in a car, but and they ended up talking about the political thing that had happened in Iceland in I think it was like late 2000s, and basically the young people had apparently taken to the streets and were like banging pots and pans and holding up traffic, and in order because there had been a bunch of banking, basically corrupt banking that had gone on in the there'd been sort of this corrupt banking, among other things, that sort of in Iceland that had they'd been hit the hardest after the global economic collapse, partly because they'd been propped up. It was like either fishing or banking, in Iceland. But anyway, just the fact that they could coordinate on a certain scale just because of their, I mean, there's only like a couple 100,000 people in all of Iceland. The whole country, it's an entire country. No, I mean, it's weird that they had giant international banks then if they were only a couple 100,000 people. But like, there's just a level of coordination available when you're a whole nation, but you're also that small of a population, that I think, something like the what was that big hippie Woodstock, right? Woodstock, don't take the brown acid or whatever. The just the level of insane, right? That was one of that was where the don't take the brown acid, which isn't it. How does that even? That's not how. What is it? Certain acid that has? I would assume it's some other horrible drug that they've put instead of LSD. That would. I guess maybe the papers were brown. There's no context for that. But anyway, the sort of coordination of enormous numbers of people around something besides whatever the fuck wants to dig its fingers into your substrate or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Where the beauty kind of is able to be tapped into, and so or preserve. If you can't, I know why the caged bird sings, right? So the sort of the fact that there's still something there, even in the midst of whatever horrifying Michael Jackson, like insane psychedelic international pressures from all these, everyone talking to you knows that you have billions of dollars behind every word, and there's all this, and you just grew up in that environment from this insane ball of talent, and young Michael to older Mike, no wonder he was out of his mind by the end. I'm away off.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Do you know what No, we're talking about.
I have no idea.
Thing at the core. I think Xander's following.
I think if you just
no, I'm not.
If you just skip to the end and then state your conclusion.
Okay, it would be that music, that sort of that beauty, in part, the signaling aspect of beauty is there, or the thing that would alter the sort of the truth weights that people apply to certain statements is partly based on evolutionary requirements that are hard to parse, that are based on when and where we form groups and under what circumstances. It's not the guy who's going to make sure that everyone is killed who's below a certain height the next day or something along those lines. You're going to tend to be more coordination at large scales requires like a spontaneity, a listomania sort of, Franz Liszt, the bunch of women would just flock to his concerts, right? So it requires something, and I'm saying it's good that it requires that, and it's probably a feature, not a bug, that there is this means of coordination that humans have around beauty and signals of talent and beauty, but that is not harnessable or mechanizable. And this probably is precisely why those evolved systems are harder for us to immediately automate, is specifically because if they were automatable, the things that, like in industry, the things that are easy to automate are easy also for, like I said, the powers that be to automate or take over or to control the means of production, man. The memes, now we're in the memes of production. Is any of this making sense about beauty? No?
Slightly. So you're basically talking about innate archetypical mythological filters that relate people's sense of beauty and truth kind of in the same way, but that what these filters are and how they work is not easy to actually predict or understand. That's what I got out of your ramble.
Yep. That's pretty much
Okay.
it. There's just something weird about the fact that, and it's the fact that Steven Pinker would then call it I know you got to go. I see you're low on battery or whatever, your laptop's dying. But that Steven Pinker called it music. It was auditory cheesecake, right? He called music cheesecake, which
Okay.
in the sense that music is not healthy and is just a sort of spandrel, I guess, or would just be this weird extra thing because of all our selection for linguistic, which I'm sure it's built up on partly on that evolutionary momentum, but there's not I don't think that there's no purpose to the fact that humans congregate at the scales we do about the sort of media that we do. So
I would agree with that.
It would persist at different scales, I think, there's something evolutionarily significant there. There's probably a reason why we do that.
Yep. And participating in music, being the concerts, being the musician isn't entirely about getting laid. It's part of it. For a lot of people, but it's not everything that there is to it. I think there's also a way of assimilating mythology.
Yeah. There's I almost wonder if the sort of bird song that leads to the reproductive element is kind of the thread at the middle of it, but you can just keep adding layers of, okay, and then this is why the bird is also kind of singing to declare its territory, and it's also singing to sort of poke and prod socially for conspecifics or other.
Yeah, that's why it's really annoying when people try to make truth claims based on that.
Right.
It's just like,
my mother said this is true. My aunt said that's true.
But then
so basically what I'm saying is, listen to me, I'm right.
So what you're saying is, no, that's the Kathy Newman.
Yeah. Anyway, it's been good, guys.
What you said, so what you're saying is, never mind, it's all right.
No.
I like the fact that we've been able to talk about Jordan Peterson without talking about Jordan Peterson.
That's true.
Okay. All right. I should go eat lunch.
Yeah.
That's
I'm gonna go work out. Get big.
Okay. Yep.
All
right, Edwin. Say hi to your biceps for me.
All right. Onward and upward.